Welcome back to the Trending Communicator. I'm your host, Dan Nestle. If we pull the thematic thread that's running through the last decade or so of communications, and maybe even of business in general, there's a strong argument to be made that we'd have a long, winding story of transformation on our hands. Business transformation, organizational transformation, digital transformation. The more we hear and use these words, the less impactful they should be. I mean, if we're in a constant state of transformation, then aren't we just working, living? It's like transformation is either the ether around us or the water in which we swim. Pick your metaphor. But I think that since transformation hits us where we spend most of our time, which is at work, it's still fair to say that we have to grapple with it. Accept it as the norm, maybe, but recognize that we need help getting through it. And as communicators, we have or should have a major role to play in guiding transformation at work. And the most critical audience, the ones who have to actually do the work around transformation, are the ones we often overlook or mishandle. I'm talking about employees, of course. It's not the first time on the show we've talked about employees as a public or employees as an important audience. But the central role they play during transformative times cannot be overlooked, especially when change is accelerated by M&A, restructuring, and other paradigm-shifting events, not to mention AI. Good thing we have people like my guest today who have spent their careers helping companies and their employees deal with transformative change. An internal change communications pro with more than 25 years in the business, she's been involved in over 40 acquisitions, capital projects, and enterprise-level integrations. An award-winning strategic communicator, an active member of the International Association of Business Communicators, and master of the communications audit, which we will get into. Please welcome to the show the CEO and chief strategist of Swing Communication, Lynn Zimmerman.
Well, thank you.
How you doing?
I'm excited to be here and chat about change comms and communication audits.
Good thing, because I set it up talking about change and transformation, so I hope we can talk about it. It's fascinating. The more that I talk to people and dig into this whole idea of transformation, whether it be in comms or not, it just dawned on me that this is something that we've been talking about forever, but it doesn't end. And maybe that's just the nature of transformation. But you'd think that since it doesn't end, or since it's something that's with us, we should have gotten a few things right over time. And I suppose we have. But I wanted to ask you, first of all, first tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into the area of change and transformation communications. And then maybe we can kind of dovetail that into what is the kind of condition of transformation and change that we see around us now. So I know it's a lot of room there to play, but let's hear a little bit about Lynn. How'd you get to where you're at?
Sure. So I have been in communications since the beginning of my career. And so, started out in an agency. I did PR. It's going to tell you how old I am, but my client was a Yellow Pages company. And so it was toward the end of, when Yellow Pages really were relevant in the world. And so it was a tough way to start out a public relations career, trying to sell local media to the excitement of, the new Yellow Pages dropping on doorsteps. And
for
so,
free.
it was an interesting way to start out my career. And, it was fun. And it was a creative challenge because we did have to try to make the Yellow Pages seem interesting. And that's, it's not an easy thing, but started out there and then, moved over to the corporate world where I worked in community relations. And then eventually started shifting my career to internal comms and really found that was where my heart was. I love helping people understand what's happening, and, making high level corporate, speak and, all of the language that, executives use and make it understandable to employees and help them relate to how the work that they're doing for the company is helping the company succeed, because a lot of times it's hard for them to make that connection. People will say, well, I just, enter information into spreadsheets.
Yeah.
I don't understand how that's going to help us sell widgets. And so that's one of the things I always try to keep in mind when I'm communicating. But so throughout my career, so I moved into several different internal comms roles, started moving around. I tell people I was moving south. I grew up in Iowa and I went to school in Kansas, and then I got a job in Oklahoma. I was convinced I'd eventually end up in Mexico. But thankfully kind of made a shift, was able to move to Colorado about, almost 20 years ago, and have been there since. But in that time, moving through my internal comms roles, I got pulled into some projects and at the time I hadn't heard the term before, but change managers, and they needed help creating a communication plan for these changes that were going on. The first change project, big change project that I was a part of was an acquisition of a company that was a pretty major acquisition for us. And there were more than 70 IT projects that needed to be done. And so that I spent about 2 years traveling to different locations, working with different project managers and change managers, and really working on communication plans around those changes. And so that's when I realized, this is the work that I'm really supposed to be doing. And
can I just pause there for a second? Because I think here's an important point that the people outside of our comms bubble, and maybe even marketers to a degree, I think the whole idea of creating communications plans and communicating around these changes is lost. You think that, okay, there's a new IT rollout, right? Mm-hmm. What has to be announced? What kind of communications are necessary? Why did you have to do 70 different versions of a rollout plan? And, the fact is, if you're in a company that has 3 people, it's not a problem. But if you're in an enterprise with different units and different people, any of these, it could be small or large changes to the way that they do work, there has to be a unified message, and there has to be some way to kind of move them along through this change. And who's going to do that? The IT team? If they don't want it to be done well, sure. Sorry, IT guys. I know there's plenty of great IT communicators out there, but I think it's overlooked that the volume and sort of urgency around those projects. So the internal comms role, or the person who's in charge of these kinds of communications, tends to be sort of like, I don't know, under the radar or like seen when they're needed, but it's a mixed bag. I feel like these people like you need to be elevated a little bit more. Maybe I'm biased.
No, I think change communication. It's a bit of a mystery to some people what that means. I actually did a LinkedIn post about 2 weeks ago where the post was all about what change communication is. And I listed all of the things that we do as change communicators. And I actually had some change managers come in and argue that I was describing the role of a change manager. Mm-hmm. And, somebody said, you should be a change manager. You need to go get your ProSci certification and do that. And I said back to her, you're not working with the right people then, because as communicators, and there is a difference between internal comms and change comms. But internal comms, because of the rate of change and because a lot of times in corporate change, the employees are the biggest stakeholder group. Internal comms is kind of the natural place for people to go. Yeah. And we need to be more, I think the beauty of bringing an internal comms person into a change project is that we have an understanding of the entire organization. We know that, HR is doing a big project rollout at the same time that this, big IT project is happening. And so, we're kind of that connector to the different groups, and we can take a higher level look at the organization and say, this is what we're doing. we're doing this over here, and then we've got this over here. And so we need to make sure that because there's stakeholder groups that overlap, we need to make sure that we're not overwhelming them with communication. We also know, we can tell people more about the organization because we know how the frontline workers like to receive information. We know how the finance group prefers to get a newsletter, or we know more about the employees and the different stakeholder groups than most other people within the organization. And so we can add more context outside of just the communication. We're there to say, here's the strategies we need to use to communicate this change. But we also should be really saying, we know about these people. We know how they like to be communicated to. We know what's going to be received well. We know what kind of language we need to use. And we know where there's going to be some resistance to certain things. And so the communicator should be a part of the core project team for a change. I will die on that hill because
couldn't agree more. Yeah.
It's because we'll ask questions. And a lot of times, the rest of the project team is so ingrained in that project. They know everything about it. And as a communicator, we're still kind of on the outside. We're not an IT expert. I don't understand all of the technical things. And so sometimes I'll ask a question that they just assume, that it was already handled. And my best example of that is I was in a project as an HR system that was being rolled out. And we wanted to put posters up because this organization had frontline workers and they didn't have computers. They didn't have access to a computer. And so we needed to have them download this app on their phone. And we wanted to do a poster with QR code and then login information. And I said, well, how are they going to log in? And the IT guy said, well, their email address, their corporate email address. And I said, so this person who doesn't have a computer and is an hourly part-time worker has a corporate email address? And this was less than a month before we went live with the new system. And so, sometimes we just know what questions to ask to make sure that the change is going to be communicated well to the employee.
Yeah. I've always said that one of our superpowers as communicators is that curiosity, the inquisitiveness of and the kind of relentless interrogation that we bring to certain projects, hopefully in a good way. Where we ask the questions that nobody thinks of, or that other people think might be, I don't want to ask a stupid question. We don't, ideally, we're not afraid of stupid questions because we know there's no such thing. Right. But, we ask a lot of questions. And the idea, for example, of assuming that frontline, factory line, production line workers can be communicated to in the same way that the accounting team can, is, flawed from the go. And they wouldn't think about that. They're looking, the change management team or the consulting team that's come in, they're looking at the Gantt chart and saying that, okay, here's the critical path for this particular implementation. The training modules go out this day. The post survey happens this day. Make it work. And it's like, okay, how are you delivering the modules? How is this being, how do the workers know what the benefits are of doing this, that they need to spend time, their precious time, understanding this? Or do they not? If they don't need to, that's another story too. That's also part of the communications. So these kinds of questions are critically important. And, I've told this story before in some ways, but, I've been involved in multiple change projects. And I wasn't brought in because of any particular expertise or understanding of change communication. It was because I was the lead communicator for the organization. And it was kind of assumed that I knew this stuff. And, luckily I know a lot of it, but I'm not focused on exactly that. The kind of things that we were trying to do or that were being, implemented should have had dedicated support because they were, as I said in the intro, they're like paradigm shifts for the organization. And, spending a few hours here, a few hours there doesn't give it the kind of justice it needs. And then you're talking about the kind of messaging that, employees typically are not going to be happy to hear. And then you have managers or leaders who are not familiar with what we do, who say, I don't know, can you just spin this?
Work your magic.
Make it just kind of like spoonful of sugar, whatever it is, get that message down. And it's like, I'm sorry, what year are we living in? We do not spin anymore. Listeners out there, I hope none of you do that. But yeah, your point about having that dedicated change communicator and going, back to what you said, that change communication is different than, internal comms, although the internal comms team often handles it. Like, what are those aspects of change communication that define it as its own discipline?
Well, I think the biggest thing when you look at internal comms, those are ongoing programs. As an internal communicator, you are focused on company culture, employee experience, and ongoing things like HR programs, those nuts and bolts, things that employees need to know about their benefits and things like that. A change, has a start date and it has an end date, ideally. You should never have an ongoing change because that would be horrible for employees to go through. But, a change has a start, a middle, and an end. And usually that involves, the ramp up of the project. The middle is the change. And then the end is once it's back to, business as usual. That's not the best term to use, but it is, it's where the change has become standard practice.
The new normal.
The new normal, exactly. Yeah. So, that it is a different, it's kind of a mindset shift for an internal comms person to look at something as, this has an end date, and we've got to really focus on, creating a pretty dramatic shift in how our employees work and think in order for this change to be successful. And it's not a natural shift for some internal communicators. It's not, I've worked with some clients who have said, I don't understand how you like change. They like to know what's happening. They've got their plan and they're really good at it. And that's why, they brought me in, because I can be that conduit between the internal comms team and then the change team. And usually, especially in IT change, there's an implementation partner. And so it's, my role often is to represent the client, the internal comms team, to make sure that, I know what they're working on. And so the change doesn't disrupt something that's important for the company from an internal comms standpoint. And then also, helping the change team know, these are the channels we have available to us, and this is the appropriate use of those channels. And, and also coming up with the strategy, how do we communicate, taking lessons I've learned from the internal comms team. This is what this group of employee likes, this is what they need, and so it's a partnership.
Yeah.
And it's hard for internal comms folks to make the time to be a part of a change, especially a large change. If you're doing a Workday implementation, that gets really busy toward as you're getting close to go live. It's communications. It has a big role in getting the organization ready to go live. And then following the go live, you have the, follow up, and you've got all the questions to answer and the things that, break and aren't working correctly. There's a pretty big communications effort with that as well.
Yeah. Handling the change. Yeah. Once it's done.
And the day job doesn't go away for the internal communicators. So, they still have to do that day-to-day stuff that is really important for the organization as well.
Yeah. And I've witnessed it from both sides, and certainly internally, as, leading a comms team and being in a comms teams and being in marketing teams. And you're right. It gets messed up. It's like, people get diverted or distracted, and you end up cutting certain activities because, well, no, we need to focus on Project X or whatever we're calling it. And sorry, I can't tell you about what Project X is, but, because of that, we're not going to be able to do town hall this week, whatever the case may be. And, that certainly does have an effect on not only morale, but also, resource availability and, the effectiveness of your overall internal comms program. or employee communications or employee engagement program, whatever you choose to call it. Something earlier as well, as you said, and thank you for kind of setting that almost boundary between what change comms is and what how it differs from what the internal comms team might be doing. This point about dealing with the change managers and kind of like being seen as, oh, okay, you're over your skis. You're doing the change manager job. Look, I'd argue that, sometimes the change manager job is a communications job, but to a point. And I was speaking with a couple of very senior comms entrepreneurs / consultants recently who are putting together an internal communications, change communications solution. And one of the things that jumped out at me was, wait a second, it sounds like you're positioning yourself as the change managers. And I'm not objecting to that. I'm saying that's an objection that you're going to have to face. So how do you deal with that? Like how do you getting to that point, where the racy chart of what's happening with an organizational change or an implementation, or an M&A, the change managers versus the change communicator, what's the line? What are the differences and where do you land?
Well, I think there needs to be a lot more education on the difference between what a change manager does and a change communicator does. I see so many job descriptions that are looking for, the director of change management and change communication. And I don't know who's applying for those roles because I would not want that. I feel like there is a very distinct line between change managers and change communicators, because even though there's a lot of overlap, the overlap in doing the stakeholder analysis, that should be something that the change manager and the change communicator should be working together on, because it's important for both of them to know what that stakeholder analysis looks like. But change manager, they're doing, I think the misperception is that change management is communication.
Yeah.
The reality is communication is a part of change management. Change management encompasses so much more. There's, the training is involved in change management. Kind of managing stakeholder expectations, the project sponsor. It is having that total view of what is happening for that change. Communicators, yes, we need that total view, but we're more focused on the stakeholder piece. How are we going to let stakeholders know what is happening? How are we going to get them to accept this change? And, what are the methods we're going to use to get them there? And so I think as change communicators, one, we need to educate people about it. And two, we need to set boundaries and say, that is not, if somebody came to me and asked me to put together a training program, I would say that's not my area of expertise.
Yeah.
You need to hire, somebody who has done trainings before and who understands it. I could probably put something together, but that's not using my skills in the best way.
Yeah. It's more like, okay, you put the training together and I will reach out to the teams that need to take the training and tell them why it's the greatest thing since sliced bread and what they need to do and how it's going to improve their life. That sounds a little like spin, doesn't it? It's more like,
right.
What I'm talking about. Like just basically it's communicated to the people.
Yeah, we will communicate. We will tell people why it's important for them to take the training, and we will tell them what the benefits to them, because that's a big part about change. And I think this is something that people get wrong, is that when you're talking to a stakeholder, they need to know why they need to change. They don't care about how it's going to benefit the company. They don't care about any of that because they're being asked to do something differently. And for a lot of people, change is very uncomfortable. They like doing the same thing. They've got it down. They know how to do it. And so, as a communicator, we need to be able to say, this is going to benefit you and it's going to make your job better. And and sometimes, and it may not even be better. It may just be,
You're
this
changing.
is how you, this is why it's important for you to make this change. And, it's not always, they're not always going to celebrate that, but we need them to say, at least I understand why I need to make this change.
And, delivering when change is bad news for certain individuals, as often happens in an acquisition or in a merger, or just a straight up reorg, where oftentimes reorg itself just means bad news to a lot of folks. It's so like, we get a lot of pressure as communicators to really transmit the CEO's vision and the leadership team's careful stewarding of the employees and the brand and so on. When in actuality, people are just like, do I still have a job? And what do we do about that? And how do we move people through this period of anxiety? The change managers are not going to look at that. The communicators will look at that. It's really interesting because, to me, the change managers are, far more project. They should be more project managers, but they also have to be, they have to understand where partnership and where yielding certain, I think, where absorbing certain parts of knowledge are critically important, where it's important to listen to and take into account what the comms team is seeing, what the marketing team, what the salespeople are saying. That all has to be valuable input for the change manager. So it sounds almost like the change communicator is ideally reporting into the change manager or dotted lining or something. Is that
the projects that I've felt were the most successful and I was able to bring the most to the project is when I was a member of the core team, the core change team, and the change manager, or sometimes there's a separate project manager, but I am invited to all of the meetings. I know exactly what's happening. It's never somebody's going to, cascade down information to me. So I'm there. I'm in the room where it happens, to, quote a great Hamilton line. But, it's important for us to hear everything that is being said, even if they're talking about technical stuff. There's still things that we can contribute by being involved in those meetings.
And, and by being an advisor as well. I am curious if over the course of the 20-something years that you've been doing this work, if you've seen an evolution in some ways, and, are the change managers or the sponsors or the people, I don't want you to say anything bad about any clients, of course, but are any of the kind of teams you've been working with, like, are they gradually understanding, or do you think they finally grasp the idea of the employees as a key stakeholder audience, but not a monolith, A, and I guess depends on the size of the company, but also B, that it has to, or that successful projects at least, and successful change requires their participation, not just their acquiescence. Is, how are you seeing that evolve through your many projects? So
I think that people, companies now know change and managing change well is important.
Yeah.
I think there's still a challenge in making that investment in having the right people involved in the change. And, like I said, that director of change management and communication, it's like they're trying to combine roles more than they should. And hopefully with education, that will not happen as much. But it is a spot that people are like, oh, we can just make it, they're change management and internal comms director. They're trying to do that. But I think the recognition that change is important is a big step. And so it's evolving. I worked on a project, and this was this corporate acquisition, the first time I was involved in change. And I was working with these project managers who weren't familiar. This was a new process. This company that I was working for is a Fortune 5 company. And so we were enormous.
Wow.
And we had a lot of processes and things that we were doing, but the change management office was new. And so we were kind of, building the plane as we were flying it, creating this process for change communication. And so I would call up, there were 70 different project managers that I was dealing with, and I would call them up and say, hey, we need to create a communication plan for your project. And I said, I need 2 hours of your time, and they're busy. And so, that's a pretty big ask. And they'd always say, I'll give you an hour. And I'm like, okay, fine. We'll do it. And then we would come in with our process that we had created. And it was we had this thing perfected. We'd come in, what's your objectives? Let's do the stakeholder analysis. And that was where the magic happened. When we pulled out the big whiteboards and we were documenting all of these different stakeholders, and we were digging in, is this group small enough? Do we need to break them out? And we would ask them, I talk about, we want to do your current state. And so, what are the characteristics of each stakeholder group? And then what are the desired behaviors? How do we want them to act? And so we'd get into those conversations, and almost all of them were like, I've got another hour for you.
Yeah.
Because the conversation was so good, and they learned so much from the questions that I'd ask them that made them think about things that they hadn't thought about before. And so, that was when I realized the power of the process that I use and how people respond to it. It's just, it's getting into the room. And, this is 20 years ago. So now it's easier because people are more familiar with change communication. They know how important it is, but it's still a challenge to get the time that you need. But when you come in as a communicator and you have a process and you can prove very quickly that this is going to be a valuable use of their time, they will give it to you. And then they're going to expect that moving forward, because once I did one meeting, and then the project manager would come to me and say, we need to do a comms plan.
Yeah. And it's also what a communicator needs to do, which is to speak to your audience in the manner in which they prefer to be spoken to. And if you're speaking their language from the get-go, you will absolutely have much more success with your message. So when you speak to project managers, you have to understand the language of project management. You have to understand, if not all the terminology, you have to at least understand, frameworks, methodologies, things that make sense, metaphors you can use, the kind of process and behaviors that you need to exhibit in order to. And I'm not saying that you have to be a chameleon and change the way that you are, the way that you act. It's really digging into your toolkit and understanding your audience, right? And if you kind of can nail that down, whether you're internal comms or change comms or external, that it's a core skill that we all have to have. What I wanted to ask you, and because this now reminds me what we talked about in the intro earlier, is this, the idea of going in with a process and a methodology that's been very successful for you, that it starts with this as is situation. What is the current state? Getting there, you've spoken to me in the past about the communications audit. And I kind of want to know more about that, because we always talk about that. We always talk about, okay, let's audit the communications. Let's audit what we've got. When we're talking about, especially in a comm strategy situation where, you need to rethink the strategy. Okay, let's see what we've got first, and then to let you decide what content you need to make. And it seems almost like in pursuit of a very, very specific objective, which is really to understand where the holes in our game are, or hey, we're saving, for example, we're saving money, and we need to put out X amount of content. And all right, I see that we have 47 legacy pieces already here, so that means that we only need to do 7 this year. Something like that. But what you're talking about with the comms audit, I believe, is a little bit more extensive, and certainly, more valuable to large organizations, especially. So, walk us through this. Like, what is the comms audit? and where do you implement it? What is it? And what are the prime steps? And educate us.
Sure. Yeah, this is one of my favorite things to talk about because they're so fun. As a consultant who gets to go in and do a deep dive into, communication practices of an organization and finding out what people expect. And so a communication overall, and the type that I do, is a very extensive look at an organization and how they communicate and how their stakeholders want to receive information. And so, we start out by talking to the client about what are they expecting to hear in this communication audit. And so they could come to us for different reasons. I've had clients come to us as, they're just a growing company and they're recognizing that the way the company has been organized in the past and how they've communicated in the past is just not working anymore because, they were organized by region. And so each region was getting different information or hearing the information in different ways. And so they realized they need to centralize how they communicate. And so, we went in with that perspective, and the questions we asked were looking at that. I've had other companies come to me and they were going through a merger. And so they were trying to identify, what are the best channels that they should keep? What are the practices that each of the companies that were merging, what they did and what was the most successful way to communicate. And so, we always go in with kind of an idea of what we're trying to hear. But then it turns into something more than that because, we're the ways we get information and do the research is we do one-on-one conversations with leaders and other key people in the organization. We do focus groups with, different groups of employees to hear about how they like to receive information and what they think is important and, how they feel, do they feel left out of some communications or do they feel like they're getting too much information or not enough of certain topics. And we do surveys, again, asking people to tell us what's important to them, what type of information is important to them, and, how they like to receive it. And we take all of that information. And then we also review, communication. So we'll take a look at, things that have been sent out over the last year. And most of the audits that I've done have focused on internal practices, but I also have done social media and external. And so talk to reporters and talk to customers and things like that. So again, knowing what the client or what you're trying to get out of an audit is a very big first step in deciding what you're going to look at, because you could go on for years doing all sorts of research, and normally you want to get the results in a few months. So having a distinct perspective of what you're looking at is an important thing. But through these audits, you also start to hear about culture issues. You hear about, things that frustrate employees that aren't necessarily communication, but it's important for the leaders to know and, for people to understand. And so the reports become this, almost a Bible of, I know I have one client that we did an audit a couple years ago and she still carries around the report in her work bag because it has so much information that helps her think about how to better communicate with her employees. And so, we try the biggest thing that when you're doing an audit like this, getting buy-in from leaders is so important, because if the leadership isn't on board, you're not going to have access to the people you need to talk to. And so when we have done audits with companies, it's, we always make sure there's an executive sponsor, somebody who can pull the strings and make sure that the leadership supports it. And so, because, getting access to pull frontline workers off of the line for an hour to do a focus group.
Massive.
It is a hard sell.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so things like that. And then once you start having conversations with the leaders, because again, we're trying to talk to leaders as well, they're much more open and they understand what we're trying to accomplish, and so they want to help because they know it's going to help them do better. And so the report itself, this final report, once you pull together all of the information, it's kind of fun to see the leaders go, oh, we knew this.
Yeah.
We recognize this was a problem, but now you've put it in writing, and so we have to fix it.
Now it exists. You've written it down.
Exactly. It's like somebody from the outside has seen this.
It's like, I've seen a lot of pitches and a lot of projects start with, okay, we're going to start with an audit. We're going to do an audit. And, as you were talking, I was thinking, actually what they're saying is inventory. We're going to do an inventory. Which is a lot different. You're talking about discovery more.
It's research.
It
is a research project, and it's extensive, and you can do audits. I talk to my clients about like doing little pulse audits, taking a look at, having regular check-ins with an executive, doing, mini focus groups or listening sessions so you can hear things. But, if you really want to get a 360-degree view of your organization and your communication practices, and it's going to help identify what's working, what's not. You may be spending, 40 staff hours a week on a company newsletter, and then you hear in a survey or in a focus group that nobody reads it past, the first article because it's too long. They don't, and the information isn't all that important to them. And so, it is an investment to do a full communication audit. It's not, and it's not an inexpensive thing to do. And it's not, it takes time, to do it. And it's hard to do internally. I always have people ask me, can we do it in-house? Yes, you can. But the benefit, and this is not a sales pitch. This is just,
I'm
realistically, it takes time. And so being able to do, 20 executive interviews and to do, 30 focus groups, again, while trying to do your day job is a hard thing to do. And it's going to take you so much more time to do it. Plus, people are more willing to open up to an outside person. I have no bias. I'm just somebody who's there to listen and ask questions.
Yeah.
And so,
or they're scared.
It's weird when you have, if you're a manager of internal comms and you're talking to the CEO of the company, are you going to be comfortable asking them, what's something that you've done that you wish you had done differently?
Right.
That's a tough question to ask.
You almost have to think of it as, look, auditors get a bad rap in many areas, especially when they're accounting related. Sometimes deservedly so, because it's very painful to go through those kinds of like accounting related audits, financial audits. People get defensive. You can't remember what you did, what this receipt was for 6 years ago. Oh, I meant to fill out the form, whatever it is. And you always think that every step is going to get you in trouble. But I imagine that framing the comms audit in the way that you do it, the outcomes are expected to be quite different than that. It's an improvement process or an enhancement, or what are the general kind of rationale for that you've actually completed the audits for, and whether it's to just get an accurate picture of what's happening, or is it for cutting purposes or for enhancement purposes, or I don't mean to lead the witness. What is it? Yeah.
I think that it's all of those things. And it's, if you're a new communications leader who just took over this role, sometimes you come into something and you're like, whoa, I can see there's a problem, but I can't quite figure out what's happening. Maybe you have a part of the organization where you're losing team members, that your turnover rate is much higher. And there may be some sort of communication issue, or if you've had a lot of change. So if you've had, 3 CEOs in the last 5 years, it's good to ask people, what's important to you to know, because there's so much uncertainty and instability in that organization. It may be that you're trying to justify a new headcount by saying, we just can't do all of these things that the organization needs because we're understaffed. And so, there's a lot of different reasons why you might want to do one.
Do you ever come to loggerheads or and have any issues with HR or with some of the other teams that that an audit might conceivably encroach on?
There, I say there's a lot of things you can expect to hear from an audit, and you're going to find out what's working, what's not. You're going to find out what people like to hear, what they want to hear. But you're also going to get some unexpected things, and you're going to hear some things that you probably don't want to hear, but you need to hear. And so, my experience is that when employees are given the opportunity to share their opinions and talk about things that are important to them, they're going to take it. And
Nice.
So, it's not just going to be about communication. It's going to be about other things, and so we may hear some things about different departments. And, I'm going to share that, because if I hear, even though it's not within our scope, I think it's important, it's part of the overall employee experience, is part of the culture. And so, we let them know you're going to hear some things that are hard. I had to tell one client that people hated the internet that she had spent 2 years building.
Oh, gosh.
And so it's hard.
Yeah.
It's very hard to hear.
Nobody likes the negative, what do you call it? The black hat, the naysayer, the person who's the cynic who all the time, the complainer. And it's almost like you're outsourcing it to a singular audit. So look, don't shoot the messenger. These are all the things we've found, and the positives and the not so positives as well. And more organizations should actually do that. Yeah.
And we try to frame it as, here's what you can do. It's not like I'm just going to come in and say your internet sucks.
Yeah.
We're going to go in and we're going to say, here's something, here are the things that people found challenging about your internet, because we know, and we all know that you can't change things overnight, and we try to say, here are some quick wins for you so that you can, the leadership team that approved the additional budget and, they're wanting to hear the results. It's like, well, here's a few things that you can tell them, we're doing this right away. Cause all of my clients are like, we go into meetings with executives and we're like, based on the results from the communication audit, we have decided we're going to do this, this, and this. And they use it, and they continue to use it, for a long time after the audit is complete, to say, this is why we're doing these things. And it gives them so much more ability to get things approved, because they can say, well, we have this research. It shows us that we need to do these things. We're
defensible and valid. And, it's one thing a lot of comms people do struggle with, because, they'll come up with ideas. And by they, I mean me. I mean, it's happened before. But, you come up with ideas and you bring it to the leadership team, and it gets into, deprioritize that. We're not doing that this year, or, we got to not, but that's the right thing to do. However, you don't have the body of knowledge upon which to base your suggestion or your recommendation. And then you run into things like, look, we've done various surveys internally. It's, where it's not packaged as part of an entire cohesive audit per se, but you do a survey, you pull in information from the employee satisfaction survey, you run these different things, and you have this data that says, listen, everybody hates workplace. They hate it. Nobody likes it. It's too noisy. It's this and that. Of course, you don't want to list it like a litany of grievances. It's not Festivus every time you walk into the into the leadership meetings. But you do want to kind of point out that there is a source of dissatisfaction with the employee experience every day, and it should be remedied. But then, if you didn't talk to the folks who were responsible for purchasing and contracting workplace, then you run into potentially those folks getting a little bit upset with you, to say the least, just like, wait a second, wait. Where's this coming from? Why is this happening? We all agreed to this and that. It's this big of an investment. They're just using it wrong, which is usually where it ends up going. Oh, they're just using it wrong, or we need to do more education about how to use it properly, or something like this, and doubling down and tripling down. Some of which are good results, though. Yeah.
Yeah. And sometimes that is, you hear something negative and, then you take it to the owner of, whatever the negative thing was. And, it's not necessarily, we have to just delete it. It could be, we need to do more training on this. We during COVID, we had to launch this really fast and just people kind of learned on the fly. And now they're realizing that they don't know how exactly, it's like they kind of learned on their own. And so they don't have the best practices of things that they can do. And so, sometimes there is an easy solution or a non, blow it all up and start over again type solution. But it is the point of, at least from my perspective, the report on the audit results should really have, it's got the reality, but it also has, here's what it could be. And so, taking that, here's what we heard, here are the themes, here are the findings, but there are solutions to all of these things. Some of them are long-term, you can't fix an intranet tomorrow. But it's like, let's start looking at ways we can make it easier for employees to use. And then, long term, we might think about a new solution. But, it's like, what are the small steps that we can take of things that we've learned from this audit? And how can we make some progress right away? And I think one of the things that I love to do with the audit results is take actual quotes from what I hear. So I record, and this is getting to your, the AI part of the conversation.
Oh, I was going to get there, but thank you for taking us there, because it's required.
Yes,
it's required on the show.
I was prepared, but I record all of the conversations. I use Otter AI, and the tools that it has. The AI tools that it has, I can go in and, I was in the conversations, so I have a pretty good idea of what the key themes were, but I can ask it, what are the themes you heard from all of these conversations, and have it, pull those out. And then once I've figured out what the themes are that we're going to report back, then I can say, okay, I want quotes from employees in this group. And so I can, in the frontline employees, I want quotes about theme A. Can you pull 10 of them for me? And so then it tells me, and I go back and I confirm, I make sure that it's telling me what the person actually said, but I can then put in the report an actual quote from an employee, and we don't identify the employees, but we say, this is a frontline employee in the Northeast region. And so the people reading the report can see where our recommendation is coming from, and have an actual person within their organization who said it, and it makes the report really strong, and it helps tell the story of why we're trying to make these changes and why we're trying to do what we're doing.
It's interesting talking about AI as it pertains to the work that you do, and how things are changing, like just transformation change. It's like AI itself is a massive transformation, or kind of enabling a big transformation that we don't even know where it's going to go. And the audit, the act of discovery, the discovery process, understanding the as is kind of where we are and what it means. A lot of that has to be human intel, right? It just has to be person to person discussions, et cetera. But the AI part of this, I think, as you've just mentioned, is enhancement. It's the ability to take all of that information and process it in ways that the single human, or even the team of humans who are combing through data, might miss, right? Or it can speed up the process a little bit. But I wouldn't remove the humans from that at all. It's just it's an additional point, an additional great data point.
Enhancement is the best word for that, because it does. I usually work with a team when I do these audits, because it is a lot of information to collect in a short period of time usually. And, we have conversations about, here's what we're hearing, so we're keeping a running list as we go along, and we're kind of formulating our themes and, all throughout. But the addition of AI to the process has made it better, because it pulls out some things that we might have heard, but because there was something else that was a little bit bigger, we may have overlooked that. And then, AI will say, well, I heard this. And we'll go back and look through the transcripts and review it and decide whether or not it is an important part to recognize. But it does help us, it's kind of a second brain.
Right.
It helps us see things that we may have overlooked in the initial process. It also helps, from a change perspective. If I'm doing a change program, I'll often go in and, as I'm starting to put together my list of stakeholders, I'll ask it, here's the stakeholders that I'm thinking, am I missing anybody? Because, in a generic sort of way, but it'll sometimes say, here's another group that you should be thinking about who might be affected by this.
At the very least, it's a second brain. When I think about everything that you're dealing with an audit, certainly with an audit, with a large organization, especially, it sounds like the process that you've kind of put together is very well suited for like medium to large organizations, especially, right? And organizations with a longer history of communications. Although I will ask you about how small organizations can take advantage of this as well in a moment. But that's a tremendous body of information that you have to gather. And I've been really bullish on things like Notebook LM recently. When this airs, it's probably going to be, sometime in March or April, but of 2025. But I think that it's only going to get more, I think, relevant to our work. The things that you can do with, creating your own instances of, what's called a retrieval augmented. Retrieval augmented generation, RAG, a instance of AI, where you build your own little database, and that's what you get the answers from in a safe and secure environment. And adding all of your research from a particular audit into a notebook, for example, gives you new ways to plumb the data and new ways to explore or to validate your thinking, or come up with other examples. This is just one thing that can make the value offering even greater, right? And it's useless without the people to pilot it, right? You absolutely have to have the insights and experience to do it. Now, with that, it's clear that, at least certainly on the show, we always talk about the future and how things are changing and what the effect of AI is going to be on your particular work. And we're already talking about that a little bit. With respect to, change management and audits, how do you see that kind of evolving now with, in addition to what we already mentioned, this kind of enhancement part, and it doesn't have to be just AI. Like, how do you see this whole thing changing as AI and other technologies force change upon our profession?
Well, one of my favorite questions to ask AI is, what am I not asking you? And
right.
it gives me a list of things that I should be asking about whatever we're talking about. And so from a change perspective, it's, what are the pitfalls that I'm missing? What are who might be able to derail this change? Because, what groups should I be looking out for? And it's mainly in a general sense, but it's, it does help kind of get the wheels turning on who else do I need to be thinking about, or what else should we be doing to, create the momentum to move the change forward, as opposed to, stopping us in our tracks.
For sure.
And so, there's so much opportunity to use AI in change and help make change more successful. I think, from a future standpoint, I think change needs to change.
We're doubling down on the transformation's not going away ever.
And because change is not going away, and I don't really like the whole change is constant. That's not how change works. Change needs to have a start, middle, and end, or else you're just creating chaos within your organization and uncertainty, and people are not going to feel comfortable. They're going to be, very negative toward anything you ask them to do. And so we need to remember that. But I do think there is, and I think about it a lot, and I don't have a solution yet. So if anybody has ideas, I'd love to have a conversation about it. But, how do we how do the internal communication team create a state where people are more prepared for change? And so we're not starting from the beginning every single time. And so I feel like there is an opportunity for internal comms teams to have, more discussion around stakeholders, around the characteristics of their stakeholders and desired behaviors, in a general sense, so that when you come to a change, and maybe it's just the characteristics. We know this group is going to be resistant to anything we throw at them, and we know this other group is going to be really helpful with change because they're ready to, tackle a new project at any time. And so I feel like the internal communicators can kind of facilitate that. It's also them really pushing leadership to talk about their vision and the mission and the values of the company and really live those and show that they're real. Because if that's an everyday occurrence, if you see the leaders, if your value is teamwork and you see the leaders actually modeling that behavior, then, that's a natural thing. Companies know that's what we should expect from our leaders, and that's how we should act as employees. Because if you only pull your values out when you're going through a major change, then it's going to confuse people. Or if you throw away your values when you announce a major change, they're going to see that as well, and they're not going to believe you. So, that's where I see internal comms has a really big role in change, is making sure that those company values and are lived and that they're understood and that people know the vision of the company, what we're trying to accomplish. And so when a change is announced, then they say, oh, well, this is helping us meet our vision because it's going to, give us a technology that makes this one part of our job easier to do.
Yeah. And it's one of those things where, we have to take the learnings of, the knowledge that we've accrued to this point and double down on it a little bit more moving forward. If change is going to happen more often, then it's more important, not less, for the leaders to be human. It's more important, not less, for the leaders to walk the walk. And, to be whatever their corporate values are or whatever their values are, you have to be aligned with their company's values. Those gaps are only going to be exposed faster and faster as we move forward into this kind of ever-changing, future or world that we're, or as we continue with this ever-changing world. And I agree with you on this whole change is the only constant. I've said it many times, I think, probably because it's a thing to say. But now that you kind of mentioned it in a certain way, I'm thinking, if change is a constant, that's just chaos. And that's the definition of chaos, isn't it? Where, you don't know what's going to happen next. We need to veer away from that. And a good kind of grounded internal comms function is one way to do that. And into the future, I don't think that's going to change much. I did want to ask you, before we kind of wind down here, about what communicators and or people who run smaller companies need to be doing, or how they can really pay attention to the value of an audit, and how they can even conduct some of it themselves, on a more regular basis. And if you think this is a softball handoff for you to talk about your toolkit, it is. so
right.
I think you've come up with a great toolkit, and I want everybody to hear about it. And I will put it in the show notes, but please.
Well, thank you. Yeah. So I think, when I talk to startup founders and small business owners, I talk to them about their core values. I think that is the most important part of a company, is saying this is who we are and these are the things that lead us as a company, and then to actually, model those values. And so, and then start thinking about communication before you're too big. Because it's so easy when you're a small company, you're a startup, you have 5-10 employees, I can just walk out of my office and talk to employees or get on a Zoom call, with the whole company, and we can communicate in that way. But once you start getting a larger number of employees, it's like you need to have a way to communicate with those folks and help them understand what the company is trying to accomplish. And so, I think, again, start thinking about it before you're too big. And if you're already too big, now's the time to start thinking about it.
For sure. It's never too late.
And really, it's like it doesn't mean you can't have a communication program. But it's time to get one in place so that employees are informed and that they're all working toward the same goals as the company. And so, looking at it from an audit perspective, maybe you don't bring in a consultant, you don't bring in a team of people, but you can go in, you can talk to employees. And that's this toolkit that I've put together. I've given some ideas for kind of pulse audit ideas. So talking to leaders and having a set, when I do an audit, I always have a script. And so every leader I talk to, we ask them the same questions. And so for this pulse audit, have a list of questions that you're always asking leaders. What is an example of a communication that they thought didn't go as well? What is an example of a communication that they think went really well? And it could be, you could be asking them about, this doesn't have to be within our company. Have you seen another communication that you think was very well executed? And so, asking them the same questions over and over again, over time, you're going to see trends. And so doing that quarterly, every 6 months, whatever, but having a cadence that you're using to talk with them. You can also do listening sessions with employees. Again, have a script, and again, create a dashboard, create something that you can follow the trends. But ask employees, what information is important to them? How do they like to receive that information? Again, do you feel like you're getting enough information about the bonus program, or so ask, but having a specific set of questions that you're asking. Also, taking a look at everything that you're doing. So, I love sticky notes. I am a sticky note person.
You should see my desk.
So, put every channel on a sticky note, and then, have, map it out, say this communication, it goes to all of these employees, but then you might say, oh, but our frontline workers aren't getting this. And, you can, if you map it out, make a visual representation of your communication channels and the things that you're producing, you're going to start to see, we've got a big gap here.
Yeah.
And, and taking a look at what kind of information is being sent out through those different channels. And so there are things that you can do that aren't, very big time consuming things, that you can do quickly to kind of get a better idea of how your communications are working and what you need to start doing in order to fill those gaps.
It's all about calm self-awareness in a lot of ways, right? Like how
yes.
Do you know what your team's doing right and wrong? And like anybody really should kind of try to get a grasp of that, I would say, if they want to succeed in the future.
And it's in the defense of internal comms folks, they're busy. These people are way too busy, and it's
absolutely
traditionally underfunded. We're understaffed, and so even adding some of those things are hard, but if you can make the time to do those things, it will help you create a stronger case for doing something new.
It's a good case for partnership across the organization as well. Like, research companies do omnibus surveys all the time. What about latching onto an HR survey or latching onto, a poll that IT is putting out or something like this. There's no reason why things have to be so siloed all the time. People can think in multiple ways at once.
And we have so many tools available to us now. Most companies have an intranet of some sort, and most of those intranet tools have a way to poll. You can just do a simple pulse survey.
Yeah.
There's a lot of different ways to get information, and we probably almost have too much data now.
Well, yeah, for sure.
In some ways.
Well, and that's where AI can come in and help you parse it, but we'll talk about that another time. So look, I will link to the toolkit in the show notes for this episode. Otherwise, Lynn, is there anything else that we didn't cover that you just like anything that you want to mention to our listeners here before we say farewell?
I think we have covered a lot of information, and I love talking about this stuff. So like I said before, if anybody has thoughts on the change of change, I love those conversations. And, what can we do as professional communicators to, it's all about the employees and all about the stakeholders who are going through those things. And so we need to really keep those people in mind as we're evolving and changing in our companies.
Yeah. Well, look, you heard it here, folks. Change of change. I think that's a watchword for us moving forward as a profession. Instead of saying change is constant, blah, 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 I think it's about just recognizing that we have to cope with change and get ahead of it and understand that, every change is a fixed change, followed by another change, followed by another change. It's not constant in the sense that we're in the middle of a big change and it's never going to end. But you can expect more changes on the horizon. And, I hope that the Trending Communicator can certainly help us all understand what those changes are. But today I really love this, getting into this whole idea of, a kind of slightly different way to look at employee communications and treating the employees as a very key stakeholder group. There are some wonderful people who've been on the show and will be on the show talking about employees as a public and employees as a core constituency, but the role that we all play and that they play in change is absolutely worth digging further into. And if you want to dig further into it, please do look up Lynn Zimmerman. Her name will be spelled properly in the episode title, but it's spelled like it sounds, and on LinkedIn. And check out her website. It is Swing Strategic Communication. So it's swingstrategiccom.com. And you'll find out more about Lynn there. Certainly her LinkedIn is very active. And please do reach out to her, connect with her. And again, check out the toolkit, which will be in the show notes. And I'm sure Lynn will post it to her LinkedIn at some point or share it with you if you ask. So, yes. Yeah, Lynn, thanks so much. This has been fantastic. I really appreciate you being here.
Thank you for having me. It's been fun.
Thanks for taking the time to listen in on today's conversation. If you enjoyed it, please be sure to subscribe through the podcast player of your choice, share with your friends and colleagues, and leave me a review. 5 stars would be preferred, but it's up to you. Do you have ideas for future guests or you want to be on the show? Let me know at dan@trendingcommunicator.com. Thanks again for listening to the Trending Communicator.